A crack in the global monetary system just widened. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have taken another step in building an alternative financial architecture and bypassing the dollar. A pilot program has been launched for a new BRICS settlement currency known as the unit.
Russian lawmakers recently said that BRIC nations are in the process of creating a new payment established on a strategy that does not defend the dollar.
I guess what President Trump did was a wake-up call for us. Not so much because we were not trading with other countries, but a wake-up call in saying that we need to upgrade our relations, our trade relations with many other countries in the world. So we've now embarked on an outreach program.
I genuinely feel the biggest financial terrorist in the world is the US dollar. All our monies are in nostro accounts, and somebody in the US can say you cannot withdraw it from tomorrow morning and you're stuck. That is the power of the reserve currency.
The first signals did not arrive as dramatic announcements or emergency summits. They appeared instead in balance sheets, settlement reports, and quiet changes to transaction preferences. Currency desks noticed declining dollar volumes in deals involving emerging markets. Trade invoices began listing alternative units of account. What looked like technical adjustments gradually formed a pattern that unsettled financial observers across the Atlantic. BRICS banks were changing behavior. For decades, the United States dollar had been the unquestioned backbone of global finance, energy contracts, commodity trades, sovereign reserves, and development loans all flowed through dollar-denominated systems. This dominance translated into influence. Policy decisions made in Washington echoed through global markets, shaping capital flows far beyond American borders. That influence had long been accepted as permanent. BRICS countries viewed it differently. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa had spent years studying the vulnerabilities of a dollar-centric system. Sanctions regimes, interest rate shocks, and liquidity tightening revealed how dependence could quickly become exposure. What began as academic discussions slowly evolved into institutional strategy. The shift accelerated quietly. BRICS development banks adjusted lending frameworks to allow settlements in local currencies, bilateral. Swap lines expanded, regional payment systems were interconnected. None of these moves made headlines on their own, but together they reduced the automatic role of the dollar in cross-border finance. America's financial power rested on habit as much as policy. The dollar dominated because everyone expected it to dominate. That expectation created liquidity, and liquidity reinforced trust. BRICS banks understood that breaking such a cycle required patience rather than confrontation. China played a central role. As the largest trading partner for many emerging economies, China had leveraged to propose alternatives. Trade settlements increasingly bypassed the dollar, using local currencies or bilateral arrangements. Chinese banks supported clearing mechanisms that reduced reliance on Western correspondent banking networks. Russia reinforced the approach from a different angle. Sanctions pressure had forced Russian institutions to develop parallel systems for payments and reserves. What began as defensive adaptation became a blueprint for others seeking insulation from external control. BRICS forums provided the platform to share these experiences without ideological framing. India approached the shift pragmatically. Concerned with trade deficits and currency stability, Indian institutions explored settlement arrangements that reduced foreign exchange risk. Local currency invoicing with partners gained traction. The dollar remained important but no longer exclusive. Brazil and South Africa added momentum, commodity exporters by nature, both countries faced volatility driven by external monetary policy. Reducing dollar exposure promised greater control over domestic financial conditions. BRICS banking cooperation offered scale that unilateral action could not achieve. The result was not a rejection of the dollar, but a dilution. Dollar usage did not collapse. It softened. Each transaction settled elsewhere reduced marginal dependence. Over time, those margins accumulated into something more significant. In Washington, concern grew quietly. Treasury analysts tracked reserve compositions and payment flows. The changes were gradual but directionally consistent. America's financial power had always depended on being the default. The emergence of viable alternatives challenged that status. Markets reacted cautiously. Investors did not abandon dollar assets en masse. Confidence remained high, but risk models adjusted, long-term assumptions were revisited. The idea that dollar dominance was immune to coordination elsewhere began to look less certain. BRICS banks framed their actions carefully. Public statements emphasized diversification, stability, and fairness. The narrative avoided confrontation. This was not about attacking the United States, but about protecting domestic economies. From external shocks, that framing resonated widely across the global South. Africa watched closely. Many African countries had experienced the volatility of dollar shortages, debt servicing pressures, and sudden capital outflows. The BRICS model offered an alternative vision where regional trade and development finance could function with reduced dollar dependency. New financial corridors emerged. Infrastructure projects were financed in mixed currency baskets, energy deals used local settlements, agricultural trade adopted flexible payment systems. Each adjustment weakened the psychological monopoly of the dollar. The siege metaphor gained traction in commentary, but reality was more complex. America's financial power was not under attack in a military sense. It was being bypassed, and bypassing, unlike confrontation, offered fewer levers for response. U.S. policy tools remained formidable. Interest rates, capital markets, and regulatory reach continued to shape global finance. Yet their effectiveness relied on participation. As alternative systems matured, opting out became more feasible. The BRICS banking strategy focused on endurance. No single announcement risked backlash, no abrupt shock destabilized markets. Instead, incremental change reshaped incentives. Businesses chose cheaper settlements. Governments favored reduced exposure. Banks adapted to client demand. Confidence built quietly. Each successful transaction outside the dollar validated the system. Trust grew not from rhetoric, but from repetition. Over time, what was once experimental became routine. America faced a strategic dilemma. Responding aggressively risked accelerating the shift, ignoring it risked erosion. The challenge lay in adapting to a multipolar financial world without undermining the strengths that made the dollar dominant in the first place. The global system entered a transitional phase. The dollar remained central, but no longer singular. Financial power became more distributed, reflecting a broader redistribution of economic weight. For BRICS banks, the objective was clear: reduce vulnerability, increase autonomy, build resilience. None of these required the dollar's collapse, only its exclusivity. As the first phase of this transformation settled, one truth became unavoidable: financial dominance was not a birthright. It was a function of trust, stability, and relevance. And as BRICS banks quietly rewrote the rules of engagement, America confronted a future where influence would have to be shared, negotiated, and continually earned rather than assumed. But through infrastructure. Once BRICS banks had normalized alternative settlements and diversified reserve practices, attention shifted to building permanence. Temporary workarounds were no longer enough. Systems had to endure market stress, political pressure, and time itself. Payment architecture became the priority, cross-border. Settlement platforms expanded beyond pilot programs. Regional clearinghouses linked banks across continents, reducing the need for intermediary institutions based in the United States or Europe. Transactions that once required multiple correspondent banks now moved directly between counterparties. Costs fell, settlement times shortened, reliability improved. This technical evolution carried strategic weight. Every transaction completed outside the dollar-based system reduced exposure to U.S. monetary policy and regulatory reach. For businesses operating on thin margins, savings mattered more than ideology. The choice to avoid the dollar increasingly looked like good business rather than political signaling. BRICS development banks deepened coordination, joint lending frameworks standardized risk assessment across currencies. Projects were financed using baskets that reflected trade realities rather than legacy norms. Infrastructure loans, energy investments, and industrial expansions moved forward without automatic dollar denomination. This had consequences for debt dynamics. Borrowers faced less currency mismatch. Sudden dollar appreciation no longer translated directly into debt distress. Fiscal planning gained predictability. Governments found room to maneuver, particularly during global tightening cycles driven by U.S. interest rate decisions. Africa's engagement accelerated. Several African countries aligned with BRICS banking mechanisms to reduce exposure to volatile capital flows. Trade with BRICS partners increasingly settled in local or regional currencies. Development financing emphasized sustainability over speed, prioritizing projects that strengthened domestic capacity. This alignment reshaped negotiating power, where African countries had once approached lenders from a position of urgency. Diversified financing options improved leverage. Conditionality softened, timelines adjusted, development strategy gained coherence. China continued to act as an anchor. Its financial institutions provided scale and liquidity that stabilized the system during early expansion, yet the emphasis remained multilateral. Leadership rotated within BRICS frameworks. Governance structures were refined to avoid dominance by any single country. India contributed depth. With a large and diversified economy, India's participation expanded the range of viable trade settlements. Manufacturing, services, and technology transactions adopted flexible payment arrangements. This diversity increased resilience, ensuring the system was not overly reliant on commodities alone. Brazil and South Africa reinforced credibility. Their roles as commodity exporters and regional financial hubs anchored the system in real economic activity. Agricultural trade, minerals, and energy deals flowed through new channels, proving that alternatives could handle volume as well as complexity. Russia's experience remained instructive. Years of operating under financial restrictions had forced innovation. Those lessons informed system design, emphasizing redundancy, cybersecurity, and legal insulation. What had been born of necessity became shared expertise. In the United States, the implications grew clearer. Dollar dominance had always relied on network effects. As networks diversified, marginal advantages shrank. Capital markets remained deep and attractive, but transactional exclusivity weakened. Financial power began to resemble influence rather than control. Policy debates intensified. Some argued for reinforcing dominance through regulation and alliances. Others warned that coercive measures could accelerate fragmentation. The tension between preserving influence and adapting to change became a central challenge. Global investors adjusted strategy rather than concentrating exposure. Portfolios diversified across currencies and regions. Risk premiums recalibrated. Hedging strategies evolved. The dollar remained central, but no longer singular in long term. Planning, trade contracts reflected the shift. Clauses allowing currency flexibility became standard. Price adjustments accounted for exchange dynamics beyond the dollar. Legal frameworks adapted to multi-currency settlement, reducing friction. Confidence grew incrementally. Each crisis weathered without reverting to dollar dependence strengthened belief in the system. Liquidity. Stress tests validated preparedness. Market participants gained familiarity, replacing skepticism with pragmatism. The narrative of siege matured. Initially framed as an attack on U.S. financial power, it became clear that no single actor was under assault. Instead, the system itself was decentralizing. Power diffused not because of hostility, but because alternatives matured. The United States remained influential. Its markets, institutions, and innovation continued to attract capital, yet influence now required engagement rather than assumption. Partnership mattered more than pressure. Adaptation replaced inevitability. BRICS banks emphasized continuity. Public messaging avoided triumphalism. Stability was the selling point. By framing diversification as risk management, they appealed to a broad coalition of countries wary of volatility rather than confrontation. International institutions took notice. Discussions emerged around interoperability. Standards and governance. The goal shifted from defending a single system to managing coexistence. Multipolar finance demanded coordination to avoid fragmentation. Africa's long-term positioning benefited. Reduced dollar exposure eased balance of payments pressure. Trade planning aligned more closely with regional development goals. Financial autonomy supported political autonomy, reinforcing the continent's strategic recalibration. Energy markets reflected the change. Long-term supply contracts adopted varied settlement structures. This reduced exposure to external monetary shocks and aligned pricing with consumption patterns. Volatility dampened, benefiting both producers and consumers. Technology supported the transition. Digital settlement platforms improved transparency and efficiency. Compliance processes adapted to multi-currency realities. Innovation reduced barriers that once favored established systems. The psychological shift mattered as much as the technical. Once market participants believed alternatives were viable, momentum sustained itself. Trust no longer depended solely on tradition. Performance replaced precedent. America's response evolved. Rather than attempting to reverse the shift, emphasis moved toward competitiveness. Financial openness, regulatory clarity, and market depth became tools of attraction rather than enforcement. Influence recalibrated. By the end of the second phase, the landscape looked different. The dollar remained powerful, but not exclusive. BRICS banks had not overthrown a system. They had diversified it. The result was a more complex, resilient, and negotiated global financial order. The siege metaphor faded, replaced by a more accurate image. Not walls under attack, but pathways multiplying, and in that multiplication, power redistributed not dramatically, but decisively toward a world where financial influence flowed through cooperation, credibility, and choice rather than habit alone.